Hello again, and thank you all so much for sitting with what's been a pretty long day of programming. It's great to see so many folks still here and listening. I think for me, this is one of the most exciting discussions that we save for last, and I wanted to take a moment to just sort of introduce the topic and sort of the thinking behind it, because you can't put on an event like this without having a policy or a regulation panel. And that's kind of where the idea of this all kind of started. The reality is, though, we're in a moment of pretty extreme flux in terms of the policy and regulatory environment. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's kind of when a new administration comes in, it's hard to, line up the folks you need to kind of give people the clear picture. I think next year we can, aspire to kind of doing that more. But the more I sort of thought about it, the more sort of the last few years of AV progress that we've seen, going from, a few little cars in a few little places to, the really dramatic scale that we're seeing today. The regulatory piece of it has actually not been really huge. What's happened is that we've had sort of this interesting idea of alignment, right? And so you hear this term alignment get used in the context of artificial intelligence, right? And to be perfectly frank, and I'm sure there's people in the room who disagree with me about this, sort of worrying about a machine god is sort of a little too abstract for my taste personally. But I think AVs present a really interesting opportunity to re-examine this idea of alignment, because I think what we've seen is sort of these self-regulating effects in the business that really, I think, line up with some of the thinking about what alignment is. And we have an amazing panel here today because we have three very different perspectives on alignment, because it is a broader thing. It's not just policy. It's not just regulation. There's ground up pieces and all kinds of other pieces. So I want to start by introducing the different perspectives that we have here on stage. Obviously, Mark Rosekind, honored to have him here. Someone I've chatted with many times before. Former NHTSA administrator. So Mark is here to really kind of speak to the sort of more regulatory perspective and some of these the self-regulating really effects that they've kind of been set up under your leadership at NHTSA. We're also joined by Zoe RIco. She comes from the world of insurance. She's the head of art and parametric analytics at Aon. So, insurance is really where the rubber hits the road. I mentioned in an early conversation that safety is one of these things that we talk about a lot. We throw the word around as this abstract concept, but it's like a very real thing. And at some point, the rubber hits the road on that. And that's where all of this work that we're all doing it sort of comes down on. And Mark de Laverne is the director of Michigan Central. And, he really has an interesting perspective on sort of how we build alignment of AVs and AV companies with sort of broader social goals from the ground up, baking them into this company. So I think we have some really interesting perspectives here. And I want to start, Mark, with you, because, again, there's so much focus on regulation and policy. And I think a lot of that is almost by default. And yet what we've seen, with the sort of approach that you set up with voluntary safety self-assessments and things like that, that there's sort of a competition for trust dynamic that is kind of unique. And maybe to some people, it's been surprisingly effective as a regulatory effect. Can you talk a little about that concept and how it's played out?
So I'm just going to begin with the perspective, which is I've been really fortunate in my career. In DC, I actually started as a board member at the NTSB. So safety is somewhere in my initials, I'm sure. And then administrator at NHTSA. And then when I came home to California, I was a chief safety innovation officer at Zoox. So I've got this pure safety, the regulatory policy piece, as well as the industry part, of how to look at this stuff. And that's why I got to tell you, I love the idea of alignment, because if you think about it, and I have to give Right AI some credit, that today's been pretty innovative talking about things. So just to be a little provocative, there's an old system that's been in place, and it's like regulate, which means that if you violate, you enforce, and you got to follow the rules or hammer comes down. And I think the challenge is there are so many things that are still to be defined that old view, that old method doesn't really work here yet. And so just two things. One is, my view is we need all this innovation. It should lead to data-driven best practices. That's what will lead to regulation. And that's why alignment is so critical right now. Because as you're pointing out, people throw out safety, trust, transparency, but they never define those. That's why it's great to be with Zoe, because she's purely analytic and quantitative. It's like, take that from the vague things everybody talks about to like, what does that really mean? So I love the idea of alignment. And I would just say, let's highlight what you said earlier, because the alignment can't just be like with the regulated and the regulator. It's got to be everybody. Everyone on here represents people in this system that have to be aligned on what's going to make this safe, trusted, transparent.
Yeah, no, and it is a technology that depends on trust, right? On social acceptance, which is fundamentally, again, you know, Zoe, you've got that analytic perspective, and a lot of it does come down to data. But I think we've seen, you know, with some of the things that have happened. I think of the what happened with Cruise, where it wasn't just a matter of a safety incident; it was also sort of how it was handled. And so it kind of, there is this really, you know, you can quantify data, but trust gets to be this sort of squishy thing. And again, with VSSAs, you kind of put the onus, instead of it being like, we set this standard, you meet it, if you don't meet it in whatever way, you somehow get punished. Instead, it puts the ball in the company's courts and said, you prove your safety, show your work. And yet, and this has been, in a way, more effective than it probably would have been to try and take that old approach to this technology, which doesn't fit it so well.
So, as you know, we put out the first AV policy. And I think what's interesting about that is we got screamed at a lot for like, you should be regulating. And I kept saying, what? Right? And we're kind of in the same boat. It's like, what should you regulate at this point? And so again, what you're highlighting is you got to define what's going to actually make a difference in safety, in trust, et cetera. And I'm going to say this, hopefully staying provocative for a little bit, which is, as much as in the industry, we feel like we have to collect so much data to show how safe it is, et cetera, that's really just for regulators. You know, when you think about the public, it is about trust. They're not going to go read all the reports that we generate or say, what's that percentage, or that latest paper, you know, how are the numbers looking at crashes, et cetera. They're not going to do that. It's going to be, I'm never going to get in that. They go for a ride. It's like, man, that was great. Can I do another one? That's where the trust builds. That's why I've been a huge supporter of, I don't care what company it is, if they're out there scaling up and doing it successfully, where they're effective, safe, and, you know, meeting the needs of the people that they're, you know, giving the rides to, that's what's going to advance everybody, right? Not just keep public. The safety reports are important for the industry and the regulators, states, federal, et cetera, but that trust is going to be built literally ride by ride.
It only takes one battle.
And that's the thing. Everybody knows that about trust, right? It takes forever to build it up. It takes one to have it go away.
Zoe, I mean, can these things be quantified? I mean, it's sort of, to some extent, it's your job to do that, right? How does the quantitative piece build into this sort of kind of vaguer, softer trust question?
So I guess for the audience, I'm a specialist within the insurance industry. I'm an actuary. So my job is risk quantification. And typically when you're looking at an auto liability type risk or physical damage type risk, you're looking at a claims history relative to some exposure base, like the number of cars, the number of miles driven, something like that. The challenge that autonomous vehicles have is that if you're creating something that is truly safer, which we think it is, then you're going to have fewer claims. To consider data to be fully credible, we have a standard. It's usually just over 1,000 claims across a 12-month period. It's going to take an autonomous vehicle scaling, or autonomous vehicle company scaling, much longer to get to that point. So we have to figure out another way to look at it and say, okay, when can we say that not having claims is good? And so that's where we spend a lot of time, is how can we look at other data, not just the loss data and the exposure data. And to the panel earlier that was talking about a lot of the simulation data. They're simulating because you want to see how the car is going to respond, and you want to see what it can do. And the reason you simulate, the reason why actuaries do simulations as well for different types of things, is because you want to see what happens in a scenario that you can't easily witness in the real world. So you have to look at different ways to make the case that you are, in fact, reducing or making a safer product. And from the early data, from a frequency perspective, we are seeing somewhere between, I'd say, a 5 to 15 factor of fewer claims compared to manual driven cars. The one part that we don't have is when the true severity claims come in and everybody goes after the robots.
Yeah, right. Because that is kind of the big X factor, and that's been sort of the self-regulatory, sort of function in a lot of ways, is when these sort of like critical, incidents happen. We see companies and billions of dollars invested kind of go away.
So one other point I will make is that with the lower frequency, we're also seeing reduced severity. So if they can't completely avoid the accident, it's a less severe accident.
From an insurance perspective, how much does the idea of a safety case give you some other thing to sort of build an insurance case on? It's not hard quantitative data necessarily, but it is sort of this showing your homework in terms of this is why we believe that we've architected and executed this system in a safe way. Is that something that you can sort of build on an insurance business on, or is it too fuzzy?
It depends. And like Mark said, everybody's tossing around the words transparency and safety and all that kind of stuff. So you need something a little more solid than just a nice write-up about why we're safe.
Okay, and so
it might mean in the future there is a discussion about having independent, neutral parties take a look at some of that. I mean, that would be another way to validate, not just what you're publishing or talking about, but having, again, an independent, neutral group that would actually come. That's done in aviation all the time.
And there are companies that have done that. I mean, Waymo partnered with Swiss Re, turning over some data and letting Swiss Re do the analysis and releasing their own reports.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark, I mean, as we're discussing the other Mark, we've seen sort of in this space what happens both when safety is not a high enough priority, but then also, again, as I was referring to, just how you communicate and how you respond and engage with public concerns turns out to be really important. And as everyone's saying, trust is something that takes a long time to build and is very easily destroyed. I think what's exciting about what you're doing with Michigan Central, incubating startups, is that it really seems like you're trying to bake this in from the ground floor, because this might not be a lesson that you can afford to even learn the hard way once.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give a little background. So if you're from Michigan, you know what Michigan Central is because your family probably came through the Michigan Central station at some point. That was the front door to Detroit. But for everybody else, you've probably seen it because it was like the headline image of the challenges that Detroit faced. You would see the stories of what was happening in Detroit, and you'd see this gigantic hunk of a building, which was the Michigan Central Station, which sat vacant for 30 years. And if you can imagine a thing, it happened in that station while it was vacant, good or bad. I used to work in the mayor's office in Detroit, and we were trying to bring Ford to come back into the city. We would have been super happy if Ford had made an announcement that they had a 10-person WeWork in Detroit, right? We would have been like, Ford is back in the city, and that would have been a great thing for the city. But Bill Ford had a much larger vision for what he wanted to do, which was restoring the train station, restoring the old book depository building next year, $950 million investment. It's just not, could happen by anyone else, anywhere else in America. And he had this idea of creating, this innovation district around mobility. He was seeing what was happening in other parts of the country and saying, we need something like that in Michigan to retain talent. And he wanted it to be Ford to be anchoring it, but not, he wanted startups, he wanted other companies all to be there. This is 2018. I think the vision was there'd be 5,000 software engineers working on different autonomous vehicles, and that would be the thing. And obviously things have changed significantly. But what we do have is, we have over 150 startups, a number of them here that are not necessarily working directly on autonomous, but are working sort of adjacent. So a company called Strut, which is working on sort of the vehicle class between golf carts and your, sedans that you see out there that are electric and autonomous. We've got a company here, Ultrium, who's focusing on AI telematics, working with an autonomous provider. A company called Block Harbor, which is focusing on cybersecurity. Cavity's working on smart roads. So a lot of companies are adjacent to this piece, but we are the elephant in the room in Corktown, the neighborhood there. And we knew going in that, we're going to have a lot of startups, and we're going to push to create a place where it's attractive to say, I want to be there, I want to build my business there and create the opportunity. But I would say almost all early stage startups do not know how to work with government and do not know how to work with it, right? Like, you've got a technical founder, you've got a financial founder, you're not hiring your external affairs person until you're like 20, 30 people. But, if you want to go do work out in the right of way, period, that's how your business can fail really quickly, is not being able to work with government and not being able to work with communities. So, we've basically worked really internally to be able to create those systems. So it's very easy for the companies to be able to plug in. So whether it's, we've have a full portal that puts data up as well as puts the pilots out in the right of way. There's QR codes. You can scan them to see like, what is that sensor? What is it doing? As well as hosting lots of community engagement. We have a full community engagement team that will either host specific sessions. We're doing a lot on aerial. So the idea of drones and just being flying around in a new community, but also working with the companies that are doing pilots so that they're having that community engagement. Because I think you mentioned it, is that very large companies in the space have struggled to work with government and struggled to work with community. And what we're trying to do is to be able to advance mobility and push hard, but push in a way that these companies can start to see how they can do this early and scale. Right. So then it's baked into the DNA, just not to the companies, but more companies come, they see that this is how everybody else is doing it, and this is what they need to do it as well. And it's deliberate, obviously, and it's also the ability, for us to be on curating this group to be able to put it together.
One important point to the is being able to work with the government and the regulators and understand the impact of insurance on a startup company or a growing company. When rideshare companies were really getting their start, the risk management teams and legal teams were going to all the different states, because insurance is regulated at state level, and trying to talk to the regulators to get a reasonable insurance requirement in place. And they did a lot of really good work, set a lot of really favorable laws. And then uninsured motorist limits, what should that be? Oh, well, we have $1 million for BI and PD, let's just do $1 million. That almost sunk it. That was the most adverse emergence we saw in losses in rideshare. It's the reason why, or a big reason why James River got out of the game and other carriers have exited. It was a colossal mistake, and it's one that they've been trying to claw back.
Yeah, I'm like, that's such a great example of alignment, right? Because it's like, it's not about forcing something. It's about showing like, hey, if you take this seriously, that good things come along with it, that it drives success. And I feel like, with Detroit, I've been going to Detroit since, about 2010, and just the progress that city has made to claw back from the challenging times. It feels like that's part of what animates, right? That like building community isn't something that just happens. It takes intention, it takes work, and it takes bringing all these, it's everyone's job, right? And so you don't get to just start a company and just come into town and just ask for forgiveness instead of permission. That is a way that you end up burning bridges, not just for yourself, but then also for other companies who are coming behind you, who may have really good ideas and really good business opportunities, right?
Yeah, I mean, the mayor's been pretty forthright about this, right? Like that he wants to see the innovation happening, but in a way that's really responsible. And it's tough for particularly companies like going and talking to Mark at a NHTSA level versus coming to go talk to somebody at a city level. It's a tremendously different conversation. But the challenge is like feds are going to regulate your vehicle itself, but the ability to say like are people going to hate you is on the city level. So I dealt with a lot of this during scooters, where the mayor brought me in one day and was just like, I want this to happen as fast as possible, and I don't want anyone to complain. Those are not usually two circles that you can kind of put together. But the city's been really intentional. They set up what was called a transportation innovation zone. LA's got a few as well, but basically to cut the permitting piece, right? To be able to make it as easy as possible for early stage startups to be able to be in there. But part of that is having a community engagement process in place, right? Like, we won't do this for you, but you need to also do this as well.
Yeah.
And we'll support you as well. So even the city is saying like, we can be able to put this like community engagement as a service piece to be able to help you start to see, because we want your business to grow, but we know your business is only going to grow, if you're doing these types of work in cities and neighborhoods, if you're actually able to talk to people and actually listen to them, as opposed to just like literally just talking to them at your thing and then walking away.
And Mark, you mentioned something that reminds me, Mark, of our work together at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education, which is, right, this was an industry-backed public education group. And one of the things that was really interesting for me to understand was that, especially some of the smaller startups and stuff, they didn't have these big teams, whether it was communications, maybe they were pre-products, they didn't even have a marketing team, that actually like public education ends up for a lot of companies serving a really important role. And there's opportunity not just for, I think, local cities, but then at the national level to have one, a body that kind of provides like the scale. It's almost like a supplier or something, right? Where they have the efficiency of scale by serving all these little startups who don't have that piece. Talk a little bit about how PAVE has sort of played a role in alignment.
Well, I was going to give that one back to you, Frank, because I think what you just raised was like the biggest barrier for you, right? It's like, oh, we can educate all we want. They want to sit in one. They want to ride in one, right? And so then you put the word out, can we get one of those? Like, well, no, we don't actually have one of those. We can send you a slide deck and, maybe a person to hit the forward button. But I think that was one of the biggest challenges because as we were saying, you really need that trust and transparency, and that comes from experience. Right, not just the rides, but even just to touch and feel and sit in it and, et cetera. It's like, what is this like? Is it going to be okay?
Yeah.
And I would just say, when you were there, that was one of the biggest challenges, right? We want to educate, but that's not just the intellectual cognitive stuff. That's kind of like put your butt in the seat and let's see what it feels like. Even better if we can give you a ride. And what's the number one thing everyone wants to hear on a ride? That was boring. Right? I mean, if you haven't heard that in a ride, having done this many, many times in all kinds of different vehicles, once you hear that, it's like, we got them. Right? I mean, that now you're starting from that. It's like, when can I get one of these? It switches from, do I trust it, to how soon can I get it?
I think one of the challenges, though, is we live in a world where, like, no one trusts anything anymore, right?
Yeah.
And, even if, pay fantastic, great work, right? But, if you're, a neighborhood in Milwaukee, you have no idea who the hell PAVE is, right?
Absolutely.
So the ability for, people that people do trust in cities and communities, and PAVE being ones to be able to put those together and everything. But like that's what you're going to really be able to necessary to have.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, unless getting people in the vehicle is the one piece, but hearing from local organizations you trust is going to be sort of to say like, okay, I feel good because that group says it's okay.
This is my neighbor.
Yes.
This is my neighbor. This is someone I share this community with.
And lose if company comes in and loses my trust and it goes away, then doesn't hurt them. But local organization that have built trust, like for us in Michigan Central, like if we lose trust of the community, like we're done, right? Like that is what we live on, and that's why it's so important to us. And that's kind of where a lot of this continues is going to be needed to occur.
And I don't want to give too many compliments, but I think this is why I'm never on a panel with someone who actually does community work, right? Or someone who's an actuarial that actually talks about the numbers. This is where the alignment strategy concept is totally different than what people are confronting today, right? Because all that trust transfer is not going to happen if you don't have a community effort to actually go out there and touch, see, experience, et cetera, right? And then have the data that's going to be able to back it up. That people are going to say, yeah, it's worth actually going for a ride because it's going to do what it needs to do and it'll be safe when it's doing it.
Yeah, no, and I think this is where it's, I think all companies probably struggle, particularly early stage startups. Like we had a company that was talking to us about flying a balloon in the air and doing stuff up there. And I was like, we could probably get community, but like you talk to the FAA, right? Like, so like, it takes all of this. And I think this is like probably a lot of the scars that a lot of companies have to this point of like, how do you knock all three of these things out in a way that makes us successful as a company?
Yeah, and I think going off what Mark was saying about PAVE, I mean, I was very conscious of the limitations, right? We were doing everything we could with what we had, but and I think the answer to this is that it needs to be a multi-piece thing. Communities bring a piece of it, national organizations bring a piece of it. And just to go off what you were saying about trust, you're absolutely right that trust is sort of, broadly speaking, at kind of quite low levels. On the other hand, we do also see weird situations where people overtrust stuff. And frankly, and Zoe, I kind of want to get your perspective on this because I think one of the challenges, if you buy into this idea of, competing for public trust, which again, I as a concept, I buy into it, but having been engaged with it, to a certain extent, the realities of it are quite difficult. But like, statistical safety claims are something where you see that the public's ability to actually judge who is making a credible safety claim and who isn't is not very good, is it?
This is why I think high schools need to put more effort on having statistics as a required class. And when I tutored people in college, I would always say, and they're like, "Why do I have to learn this?" And we said, "People can't manipulate you because it is so easy to manipulate." And even if you look at event records that come out about autonomous vehicles, that's every single thing that has happened in an autonomous vehicle.
Yeah.
And they know it with certainty that the car was keyed, a grocery cart ran into it, somebody kicked it on the curb because they didn't like it, it got into an accident, somebody rear-ended it, whatever. If you look at the NHTSA data, for example, which I have plowed through the NHTSA data, that's not every single accident that has ever occurred. And NHTSA is very public about that. They even give percentage estimates of how many accidents they think they're capturing. It's mostly focused on highways where autonomous vehicles are mostly focused on back roads. So it's difficult to do an apples to apples comparison. There's a lot of different hoops that you have to jump through. And so if you look at just base number of claims and you can get some sort of exposure base to compare it to, it might appear as if AVs have a higher frequency because you're seeing every single event. But those are really events. They're not all true accidents. If you take out just the ones that are accidents, it is definitely a much lower frequency.
Right. And
The databases just aren't super solid. Just to scare you, we all like to talk about the number of lives lost. It's over 100 every single day on our roads. That's collected by NHTSA by literally getting police reports from every constituency within the country. That's why it takes sometimes 12 to 18 or 24 months when you get the final data. And that's for did you die or not?
Yeah.
So when you get to these other things, it's like the database, which again is why the alignment's so critical, right? Because if you don't have all these people helping you collect that information, you're never going to make progress.
Yeah, and NHTSA has great data, but it was focused on highway safety and trying to reduce fatalities. It's very focused on that particular cause, but that's not always what you're trying to address.
So you mentioned this standing general order data that, for those of you who don't know, is a relatively new thing that the government has been collecting, both ADAS and ADS incident data. I guess this is maybe there's some question about whether this will continue to be a thing. I guess a year from now we'll have a little bit more clarity on that. But I'm curious because you sort of alluded to this, that putting statistics out there, putting data out there, if you're a sophisticated practitioner, it can be really useful, but it can also be possible to kind of draw some of the wrong conclusions about it. Do you have a feeling, has that been a positive step? Have there been drawbacks to it? I'm kind of curious in a variety of perspectives here, but I'll start with you, Zoe.
I mean, a lot of the data that I've seen that's been publicly released is focused more on percentage reductions in number of claims, and not talking about specific frequencies or numbers of claims. And I think that is because it is difficult to get a true apples to apples comparison. As cars become smarter, you can collect data, and there may be better ways to address it in the future, but that's a lot of data, and it takes a lot of money to process all that data and to store all that data. So we'll see what comes out of it. And then, companies are understandably very tight with their data. So they consider it a competitive advantage to know things that other companies may not know. So I think what gets released ultimately will be what a company sees as worth their while to release, to maybe advocate that they are safer, or what the government ultimately requires them to release. I mean, a lot of the data that is collected on insurance companies isn't because the insurance companies want to hand it over. It's because the government said you have to hand it over.
Okay. Well, I was just the historical lesson is, the only reason we even talk about a lot of this stuff is when California first gave its permits, you had to give them, right? How many miles did you drive?
Yep.
And your disengagements. And so everyone talked about disengagements until about a year or two when everyone said, why are we doing this? It's not really very helpful. And if you knew what was going on in the companies, they were having these, committees that would get together and say, do we have to report that one or this one, et cetera kind of thing. So the SGO, if you think about it, that was at the state level. The SGO was the first sort of federal effort to try and figure out, and I'm just going to say, I think the initial intent of, we don't have any data that shows even where these are operating. We have no idea what's happening on the road with them. That's a really good thing to do, right? But I think what we're seeing is, again, like with the disengagement, et cetera, maybe this is not serving a purpose that we really had planned for or can actually advance the industry by using the data we're collecting. And so to your point, I don't know if we're going to see it go away, stay, etc. But it would be nice to see it maybe kind of reinvented or maybe reformed a little bit or whatever, because we need that data. And it's just maybe we need a collaborative to get together and figure out what would be the most useful thing for us to make available, not on the federal level, but the states could get it. And there could be some transparency. They could also let other people have access where it could be useful.
Be our next panel. What data do we need?
What do you think about, one of the things we have seen is sort of like this swap of like, we'll give you an exemption from FMVSS, from the motor vehicle safety standards in exchange for you sharing data. Do you think that's a model that we'll see more of going forward? Obviously, again, adjusting for all the uncertainty in the political sphere right now.
Well, I wouldn't do that. I mean, I would make everybody's got to submit. It's not just whether you have an exception or not. I think what you're talking about is we don't have enough data for all these situations. The ones that are out there without exemptions, the one that might be out there with exemptions in the future. I think we need more data in all those areas. And it's so we said, we need a group to come together and say, so what's the data we actually need? And as a scientist, it's amazing how people are just like, we'll collect this, we can collect that, we got all this data here. As a scientist, it's kind of like, what's our objective? What's a hypothesis we want to prove or disprove? Let's collect the data that allows us to answer that question. Oh. That's not how any of these systems got set up.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you don't want to have to sit there and read through all the accident reports. And I've read through a lot of the California accident reports, and I remember getting to one, and I like to drive. My husband and I share custody of a Corvette, and we take it out on racetracks from time to time. So when I first started working with AV companies, I'm like, I don't want the robots to win. And then you start reading the accident reports, and it's like, oh my God, they're going to win. But there does need to be data that's good for telling the story.
Right.
So, we've been talking a lot about data, about sort of quantification of safety and things like that. I think I have a little bit of a unique perspective, having come to cover this sector from a very non-technical background. I do not even have a bachelor's degree, and I studied political science, and I've had to, I've had to cover companies where I can't see behind the curtain. I don't know. There's a lot of trust that you're being forced to take. And one of the things that I found that's been kind of weirdly necessary is to develop a little bit of like this gut level feel of like, is the vibe right here? And I feel like that's weirdly where a lot of this kind of ends up coming down to, because like people aren't always doing the math on the statistics. Like trust does come down to a feeling a lot of times, right?
So, and I'll just start the conversation, which is, I think it needs to be both, right? And you need the data, whether it's for regulators or people that want to know that things are okay, et cetera. But you also have to have that trust at the gut level. And that's where the experience and things are really critical. And that's part of, again, people don't define safety. They don't define the risk sometimes. They don't define what you mean by trust and transparency, et cetera. But I would just say one thing is, you want alignment, it's got to be all those things. And people say, oh, if we just have really good data, everybody's going to be lining up to get in our vehicle. That's not the way it's going to work, right? It's got to have the feel. It's got to have whatever trust that the person in the city thinks it's okay. If you don't have all those, it's not going to work.
Yeah. And when it comes to like when companies are putting out statistics, or you see something on the news, if it makes me ask relative to what, then I don't have a high trust level for it. Because I feel like they're putting the data out there in a manipulative way.
That's a really good point.
And so yeah, I mean, if they can give it in a way that, and I'm not advocating for benchmarking, because if you're comparing yourself to your peers, you're assuming that they got it right, which may or may not be the case. But if you can have it relative to something, so number of incidents relative to some exposure base, or normalize it in some way so that it's comparable. But if it makes you ask relative to what, then probably not a good trust factor.
Which is why the communication is critical too,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
That's where the PAVE and education is really important. What really matters, what doesn't.
Yeah.
And by the way, here's where they're trying to pull something over your eyes. Here's one where it really, makes the difference between life and death.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think I've ever met a founder that doesn't have super strong conviction. I don't think I've ever met a GA person who won't be able to like recite like literally what they were told to recite, right? So ultimately, like, and I think you do a great job of this and just asking questions. My background in traffic engineering do this as well. It's just like understanding the vibes and just being like, can you get the feel of like, is this real or not? Or just like spending time. And unfortunately, like the only way to do that is to have tons of interactions, right? You stick a new person in a regulatory standpoint, they get this, they get overwhelmed and like, they're just like, great, right? Because they haven't seen the bullshit that like is involved in so much of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from my perspective, how I've been able to do all this is to bring diverse perspectives together, have conversations like this. So in a weird little way, I do feel like even right at this event, which will definitely happen again, is one of these many pieces that all have to kind of come together to build some alignment. Certainly the three of you sharing all of your deep experience and wisdom is a really important part of that. I can't thank you all enough for taking the time to be here today for this event, and really thank you to everyone who showed up. This has just been such an incredible dream come true, and yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.